You're all aware that in 1 Nephi, I believe it's the second verse of the whole Book of Mormon, Nephi says that I make this record in the language of my fathers, which consists of the language of the Egyptians and the learning of the Jews. And of course they left Jerusalem where Hebrew was spoken. So there has been it's been a matter of discussion and debate among LDS scholars whether they spoke only Hebrew or Hebrew and knew something of Egyptian. But that debate has never really been resolved. In fact, I've discussed it with a few of the LDS scholars at BYU and mentioned to them that the real way to solve that debate is to look at American Indian languages. Now, let's give you a little background. We don't have time to make you linguists, and we don't have time to teach you Hebrew and Egyptian, but we're going to try to give you an overview of some of the basics. The Book of Mormon is an account of the people of Lehi mainly, but others, the Jaredites and the Mulekites. And of course they came out of Jerusalem, presumably speaking Hebrew or something of the Northwest Semitic dialect, and came to the Americas and populated, their population increased in the Americas. Looking at American Indian languages, there are approximately 2,000 American Indian languages, or there were, I should say, about 1,000 now. About half of them have become extinct in the last few centuries. The critics of the Book of Mormon say that no one has shown evidence of any American Indian language being descended from Hebrew or Egyptian, thus discounting the Book of Mormon. Or no one has shown it to the satisfactory of the linguistic community. Now, a linguist is a language scientist. They are the final word on whether two languages are related or not. I am a linguist. I've been researching in a particular language family for the past 30 years, and we're going to focus on that language family. In fact, let's talk about language families before we go any further. A language family starts out some ancient time. They call this a proto-language, the original language, the old language. And from this are descended other languages. And interestingly, each of these languages, given time, will also separate. People move and go different places, and the language changes with time. In fact, all living languages are always changing. So is English. Every living language changes. And from those, these become separate branches, and other languages develop. You get the picture. Anyway, in the Americas, there are about 2,000 languages. And these languages are organized into about 157 different language families. That means that there are 157 different groups of related languages, each group coming from its proto-form, but these different groups are not necessarily related to each other. Some proposals have proposed that, hey, this group or this group of groups are related in a larger picture, and some of those will inevitably be shown to be the case. But as of now, there are about 157 language families. That's quite a few. If we look at the time depth of Lehi came to the Americas about 2,600 years ago, only 2,600 years ago. If we look at other language families with a time depth of 2,600 years, for example, the Latin or Italic language family has descended from Latin. You have Spanish, French, Portuguese, and so forth, descending from Latin over about the last 2,000 years. Germanic, that's the language family that English belongs to, and also German and Dutch and many of the Scandinavian languages and so forth, all descend from Proto-Germanic, we call it, over about the last 3,000 years. So when you look at the similarities of language descended from Latin, they're very similar. There's no problem seeing the relationship. Same thing with Germanic. We should see something like that in the Americas, and yet it is problematic to see that. First of all, if Lehi was the only one in the Americas, then there should only be one language family instead of 157. So we know that many other groups have come to the Americas besides Lehi. In fact, there's, of these 157 language families, 2 of them are convincingly demonstrated to be from across the Bering Strait. Probably others were as well. But the language evidence suggests that 2 of these, at least 2 of these, came from across the Bering Strait. A third one has some evidence for it. There are language families also, well, I should say languages also, let me back up a bit. So the many sources of these language families would include Bering Strait people who entered the Americas. You have Lehites, or Lamanites and a few Nephites. You have the Mulekites. Now remember, the Mulekites and Nephites mixed in the Book of Mormon about 200 BC or so. That's just a guess. And that group of Mulekites might only be one of many. I mean, the group of Mulekites that the Nephites mixed with would only be one of each of the branches. In other words, you'd have many other Mulekite descendants probably, and this one group mixed with the Nephites. You'd also have other groups of Lehites, and only this one group mixed with the Mulekites. You also probably have leftover Jaredites. My guess is that the Jaredites might be as prominent in the Americas as any, mainly because of 157 different language families. And of course, the Jaredites date from about the Tower of Babel, which is, basically the history of the earth since Noah, anyway. So you have, and there are probably many other sources besides those. And what happens is when language groups get in contact with each other, the languages mix. Many languages are mixtures of various languages. For example, English. English is very much a mixture. It comes from Old English originally, so it's called a Germanic language. However, at various points in time, Latin, English has borrowed a lot from Latin, and the 2 or 3 centuries after 1066, when the Norman French speakers conquered the British Isles and ruled for a couple of centuries or whatever, much French was borrowed into English, so much French and so much Latin and other times that in an unabridged English dictionary, the Germanic part of our vocabulary is actually quite small compared to the Latin dimension of our vocabulary. But we still call it a Germanic language. Now, this kind of thing has probably been happening in the Americas. Bering Strait languages, old leftover Jaredite languages, Lamanite, Nephite, Mulekite languages, and a lot of other things that have arrived in the Americas besides those have been mixing, and so it's a very sticky mess is what it is. Nevertheless, there's one language family that we'd like to focus on, and that is the Uto-Aztecan language family. The Uto-Aztecan language family, the Uto-Aztecan language family is a group of about 30 American Indian languages that linguists recognize as being one language family descended from a single language, proto-language called Proto-Uto-Aztecan. There are about 8 branches of it. In other words, it divided into about 8 different groups, and then those had, other descendant languages. This language family exists in the southwest United States and in northwest Mexico. The name Uto-Aztecan comes from the Utes on the north, here in Utah, and the branch related to the Utes, which includes the Shoshone of Wyoming and other languages in Nevada and eastern California. And Aztecan, because that's the south end of the language family. The Hopi, for example, are a Uto-Aztecan language. Pima and Papago in Arizona. The various Ute groups. There are a number, about a dozen languages in Southern California, where the northern branch split and spread from. There are about 15 languages in northwest Mexico, the Tarahumara, the Great Distance Runners, and Cora and Huichol and Yaqui, and many of the Tepiman languages. Anyway, we don't have time to really go into a lot of detail of that, but the Uto-Aztecan language family is an American Indian language family that is one of the larger ones. I mean, 30 languages is quite a few. And what we want to do is, this is some research I've been working on for a number of years. It has not yet been published, but it will be. You know, give me another 2 or 3 years maybe. However, I have shared it with prominent Semiticists and Uto-Aztecanists, and I'm Uto-Aztecanist myself, so I've shared it with my peers, and those who I've shared it with privately are quite overwhelmed at the number of similarities and the closeness of them.